Thunder split the sky as Nora Blackett took shelter beneath a rocky outcropping, clutching her sodden skirts and wondering if she'd ever find a place to call home in this unforgiving Montana territory of 1878. The boom echoed across the vast prairie, sending her horse into nervous whinnies as rain lashed sideways, turning the trail into a river of mud. This wasn't how she'd imagined her journey west would end alone, lost, and at the mercy of nature's fury. Quinn Eastwood saw the flash of blue among the gray address. He realized with a start and turned his stallion toward the outcropping. No one should be caught out in this storm, especially not alone. The cattle could wait, they'd hunker down well enough. A human life was another matter entirely. "Hello there," he called over the wind's howl, pulling his horse to a stop and dismounting in one fluid motion. Water cascaded from his wide-brimmed hat as he approached. "Are you hurt, madam?" Nora looked up, startled by the sudden appearance of the tall figure. Rain dripped from his leather chaps and dark beard, but his eyes were kind beneath the shadow of his hat. "Not hurt," she answered, voice barely audible above the storm. "Just lost, I think." "The stage left me at Carson Creek, but my uncle's homestead," she broke off, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I'm afraid I've taken a wrong turn somewhere," Quinn nodded, understanding immediately. "Carson Creek's a good 15 miles back," he said, crouching down to her level. "Your uncle wouldn't happen to be Henry Blackett, would he?" Hope flared in her eyes. "Yes, do you know him?" A shadow crossed Quinn's face and he removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "Miss, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Henry passed on last winter. Pneumonia took him fast." He paused, allowing her to absorb the shock. "Folks tried to send word east, but I was already traveling," she finished numbly, the last of her hopes washing away with the rain. Her uncle, her last living relative, gone before she'd even arrived. Thunder crashed again, closer now. Quinn glanced at the darkening sky. "We can't stay here. My ranch is about 2 miles west. Not much to look at, but it's dry and safe. You're welcome to shelter there until we figure something out." Nora hesitated. Propriety dictated she refuse, but survival instinct won out. "Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, Quinn Eastwood." He extended a calloused hand. "And you'd be Nora Blackett." She placed her smaller hand in his, feeling its strength and warmth despite the cold rain. "Well, Miss Blackett, let's get you somewhere dry before this storm gets any worse." The ride to Quinn's ranch was a blur of rain and thunder, with Nora perched uncomfortably behind him on his horse, her own mount tethered and following. She clung to his waist, face pressed against his rain-slicked coat, too miserable and shocked to worry about impropriety. When a structure finally loomed out of the gray curtain of rain, Nora almost wept with relief. It wasn't the grand farmhouse she'd imagined, but a modest cabin with a large barn nearby. Quinn headed straight for the barn, guiding his horse through the wide doors that stood partially open. Inside was blissfully dry, the air heavy with the scent of hay and horses. A lantern hung from a beam, casting a warm glow over the recently constructed interior. "This is new," she observed as Quinn helped her down, her legs wobbling from the long ride. "Built it myself this past spring," he said, a hint of pride in his voice as he began unsaddling the horses. "The old one couldn't handle another Montana winter, lost half my feed stock when the roof caved in from snow." He gestured toward a ladder. "There's a loft up there with some blankets. Make yourself comfortable while I tend to the animals." Nora climbed up, discovering a space surprisingly well appointed for a barn loft. Clean straw covered the floor, and woolen blankets were folded neatly in one corner. From this vantage, she could see the entire barn's sturdy posts supporting tight-fitting beams, the walls solid with barely a draft. This was no hastily constructed shelter, but a carefully crafted building made to endure. Quinn joined her sometime later, bringing a small bundle. "I fetched these from the house," he said, offering her dry clothing, a man's shirt and trousers that would swallow her whole but were blessedly dry. "The storm's getting worse. Best we stay here tonight. The animals get nervous alone during the bad ones." Nora nodded, too exhausted to protest. Quinn respectfully turned his back while she changed behind a stack of hay bales, then busied himself making a small fire in a metal brazier near the center of the loft, where the heat could rise safely away from the hay. I'm sorry about your uncle, Quinn said softly as they sat across from each other, the small fire between them casting dancing shadows. Henry was a good man, helped me when I first came here 5 years back. I barely knew him, Nora admitted. He and my father had a falling out before I was born. When my parents died last year, his letter was the only response to my inquiries about family. She stared into the flames. Now I truly have no one. Quinn studied her across the fire. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair that had begun to dry into wild curls around her face. Despite her evident exhaustion, she sat with her spine straight, dignity intact. "What will you do now?" he asked. Nora laughed without humor. "I have no idea. My funds are nearly depleted from the journey. I suppose I'll need to find work in Carson Creek." "There's not much there," Quinn warned. "Just the general store, saloon, and stagecoach stop. Then perhaps Helena or Bozeman," she shrugged. "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Eastwood." "I taught school back in Pennsylvania," Quinn nodded thoughtfully. "We could use a teacher around these parts. Lot of families scattered about with children learning their letters from mothers who barely know them themselves." He paused. "And there's your uncle's land. By rights, it's yours now." Hope flickered in her eyes. "Truly, it's not much. 80 acres, small cabin. It's been sitting empty since winter." Lightning flashed, illuminating the barn through the cracks between boards. The thunder that followed rattled the lantern, and Nora jumped despite herself. "Don't worry," Quinn said softly. "This barn won't budge. Built it to withstand worse than this." As if to challenge his claim, the wind howled furiously, but the sturdy structure held firm, barely a creak to be heard from its well-fitted joints. "You did a fine job," she murmured, impressed. "I've never seen a barn so solid." Pride flashed across his face. Lost too much to storms before." He poked at the fire. "Out here, you learn to build things that last, or you don't survive." They talked through the night as the storm raged outside, swapping stories of their lives. Quinn spoke of his journey west after the war, seeking peace and purpose. Nora told him of teaching children in a one-room schoolhouse, of losing her parents to influenza, of her dreams to start anew. Morning arrived with startling brightness, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the night. Nora awoke wrapped in blankets, Quinn nowhere to be seen. She changed quickly back into her now dry dress and climbed down from the loft to find him feeding the horses. "I can take you to your uncle's property today," he offered when he noticed her. "See what state it's in. No obligation to stay if it doesn't suit." The land that had belonged to Henry Blackett was a pretty plot nestled in a small valley, with a creek running along one edge and rolling hills providing shelter from the worst of the winds. The cabin, however, was in poor repair, with a partially collapsed roof and a door hanging from one hinge. "It's not much," Quinn acknowledged as they stood before it, "but the land's good, could grow just about anything in that soil." Nora surveyed the property, hands on her hips. Where others might have seen ruin, she saw potential. "It needs work," she agreed, "but it's mine, or it will be once I've sorted the legalities." Quinn smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "That's the spirit that built the West, Miss Blackett." "Please," she said, turning to him, "call me Nora." Over the next few weeks, Nora stayed in Quinn's spare room while they worked on making her uncle's cabin habitable. Quinn insisted on helping, saying he couldn't in good conscience leave a lady to tackle such a project alone. Nora suspected he was also checking on his cattle, which grazed on the adjoining property, but she welcomed his assistance nonetheless. Word spread quickly about the new arrival to their remote corner of Montana territory. Neighboring ranchers and homesteaders began to stop by, ostensibly to introduce themselves but clearly curious about the single woman who'd inherited Henry Blackett's land. Martha Wilson, wife of a rancher 5 miles east, brought fresh bread and preserves. "We've been hoping someone might start a proper school," she said, eyeing Nora hopefully. "Got 4 children of my own and the Johnsons have 3 more. We take turns teaching them what we can, but I'd be delighted to help," Nora interrupted, genuinely pleased. "Teaching is my calling." Within days, plans were underway to use the community meeting hall in Carson Creek as a schoolroom 3 days a week. The prospect of income eased Nora's worries about surviving her first winter in Montana. Quinn proved an enigma during these busy days. He worked alongside her from dawn until dusk, repairing her roof, rebuilding her porch, reinforcing walls. His hands, strong and sure, moved with practiced ease. Yet he shared little of himself beyond practical matters, maintaining a respectful distance that both relieved and disappointed her. It was during one of their shared lunches, sitting on her newly constructed porch steps, that she finally breached his reserve. "Why did you never marry Mr. Eastwood?" she asked boldly, immediately regretting her forwardness. "Forgive me, that's terribly inappropriate, Quinn," he corrected gently. "After all this work together, surely we can use given names." He took a bite of the cornbread Martha Wilson had brought, considering her question. "I was engaged once, back in '67. Her name was Sarah." Nora waited, sensing there was more to the story. "She died of fever before I returned from the war," he continued matter-of-factly, though she saw the old grief in his eyes. "After that, well, ranching doesn't leave much time for courting. Most women want more than a hardscrabble life in the middle of nowhere." "Not all women," Nora said softly, surprising herself with the words. Their eyes met briefly before Quinn looked away, clearing his throat. "We should finish the west wall before sunset." As summer faded into autumn, Nora's cabin became a home. Quinn had insisted on building her a proper hearth, replacing the dangerous cracked stones of the original. "Fires are as dangerous as storms out here," he'd explained as he carefully mortared each stone into place. "Can't have you burning down just as you're getting settled." The school in Carson Creek flourished with 12 students ranging from age 6 to 16 attending regularly. Parents paid what they could sometimes cash, more often goods. Eggs, flour, a side of beef, knitted socks for the coming winter. Nora found herself not wealthy, but comfortable, respected, and increasingly attached to this wild country. And increasingly attached to Quinn Eastwood, though she scarcely admitted this to herself. His visits had become routine, checking on her when he rode out to count his cattle, bringing extra firewood, stopping by with game he'd hunted. They would share coffee on her porch, talking easily about everything and nothing. He taught her to shoot the rifle he insisted she keep for protection. She taught him to make proper biscuits when he complained about his own leaden efforts. Autumn's chill deepened, bringing the first threat of snow and with it, worry. Quinn arrived one afternoon with his wagon loaded with split logs. "Winter comes fast here," he explained, stacking the wood along the side of her cabin. "Need to make sure you're prepared." "I can't keep accepting your charity," Nora protested, though she was grateful for the firewood. Her own attempts at chopping had been pitifully inefficient. Quinn straightened, fixing her with a serious look. "It's not charity, Nora, it's being a good neighbor." He hesitated. "And I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you." The intensity in his voice made her heart quicken. "I'm more capable than I look," she said, trying to lighten the mood. "I know that." His smile was quick, genuine. "Still, first winters are hard. I lost half my cattle my first year." Didn't understand how brutal it could get. His expression grew distant. "That's why I built that barn, needed something that could withstand anything nature throws at us." "Us," Nora echoed, catching the pronoun. Quinn looked flustered for perhaps the first time since she'd met him. "Figure of speech," he muttered, returning to stacking wood. The first snow fell that night, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Nora stood at her window, watching the transformation with wonder. The land looked softer somehow, the harsh edges of rocks and uneven ground smoothed into gentle curves. In the distance, she could just make out the silhouette of Quinn's barn against the pale sky. 2 days later, Quinn appeared on her doorstep looking grave. "Storm's coming," he said without preamble. "Bad one, according to my knee." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Your knee forecasts weather now. Took a Confederate bullet there in '64. Aches something fierce before a big storm." He wasn't smiling. "Nora, I think you should come to my place until it passes. Your cabin's better, but it hasn't been tested against a real Montana blizzard." Pride warred with common sense. "I can't just abandon my home at the first sign of trouble." "It's not the first sign, it's experience." Quinn's jaw was set stubbornly. "Lost 2 good men in my company who thought they could wait out a winter storm in a cabin not much different from this one. Found them frozen come spring." Fear flickered through her, but she stood her ground. I have plenty of firewood, thanks to you, food enough for weeks. I'll be fine. Quinn raked a hand through his hair in frustration. Nora, please, my barn is very sturdy. Yes, you've mentioned it. She softened her tone. I appreciate your concern, truly, but I need to know I can survive here on my own. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. At least take my horse. If things get bad, you ride to my place. Promise me. I promise, she said solemnly, touched by his concern. The storm arrived with a vengeance that night, howling like a living thing as it battered at her walls and windows. Nora fed her fire and tried to ignore the way the wind found every tiny gap in her cabin's construction, sending icy drafts across the floor. Snow piled against the windows, eventually blocking them entirely. By morning, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped alarmingly despite the fire. Nora piled on every blanket she owned but couldn't stop shivering. When the roof began to groan ominously under the weight of accumulated snow, fear finally overcame stubborn pride. Bundling herself in every layer she possessed, she fought her way to the lean to where Quinn's horse waited. The animal was nervous but obedient as she let it out into the blinding white. Mounting was nearly impossible with her numb fingers, but desperation lent her strength. The journey to Quinn's ranch was a nightmare of white confusion. Only the horse seemed to know the way, plodding steadily through drifts that sometimes reached its chest. Nora lost all sensation in her feet and hands, and her face burned with cold where it was exposed to the relentless wind. When the dark shape of Quinn's barn finally materialized through the swirling snow, she could have wept with relief. Her fingers were too stiff to work the latch, and she was pounding weakly on the door with a frozen fist when it suddenly swung open. Quinn stood there, his expression transforming from surprise to alarm as he took in her snow-covered form. Nora, God Almighty. He pulled her from the horse and carried her bodily into the barn, kicking the door shut behind them. The sudden absence of wind was shocking. Nora blinked in the comparative dimness, registering the blessed warmth of the space. A small stove burned in one corner, and lanterns hung from beams, casting a golden glow over stalls where Quinn's horses watched with mild interest. Can't feel my feet, she managed through chattering teeth as he set her down on a bale of hay. Quinn worked efficiently, removing her snow-crusted outer garments and wrapping her in a thick blanket. He knelt to pull off her boots and began rubbing her feet with his strong hands, trying to restore circulation. You're a damn fool, Nora Blackett, he muttered, but the fear in his voice belied the harsh words. Could have frozen to death out there. Why, you were right, she admitted through chattering teeth. Cabin C couldn't handle it. His eyes softened as he continued to rub warmth back into her extremities. Most people can't admit when they're wrong, especially not after nearly freezing to death. I'm not most people, she managed, a hint of her usual spirit returning as feeling painfully reawakened in her toes. Quinn's smile was warm with something more than relief. No, you certainly aren't. The blizzard raged for 3 days, during which Nora stayed in Quinn's barn. He insisted she take the small room he'd built in one corner, originally intended as a place to monitor sick animals during birthings, but comfortable enough with the addition of a proper bedroll and extra blankets. Quinn himself slept near the stove, tending it through the nights to keep the temperature steady. They established a routine, caring for the animals together, sharing meals, talking long into the evenings by lamplight. Quinn proved to be an excellent storyteller once his reserve had thawed, regaling her with tales of his early days ranching and the characters he'd encountered. Old Jeremiah Thompson claimed he could predict winter severity by the thickness of rabbit fur, he told her as they sat drinking coffee, the storm still howling outside. Swore by it. One November he announced we'd have the mildest winter in a decade. And did you? Nora asked, smiling. Worst blizzard in living memory hit 3 weeks later, Quinn said with a chuckle. Poor Jeremiah never lived it down. Every time it snowed after that, someone would ask how the rabbits were looking. Nora laughed, the sound bright in the warm air of the barn. Quinn paused in his story, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. What is it? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. Nothing, he said softly. Just, it's nice hearing laughter in here. Makes it feel more like a home somehow. On the morning of the fourth day, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a transformed landscape of towering drifts and crystalline beauty. Sunlight bounced off the snow with blinding intensity as they stood in the open doorway of the barn, surveying the scene. "I need to check on my cabin," Nora said, though the thought of leaving the warmth and safety of Quinn's barn and his company filled her with reluctance. "We'll go together," Quinn decided, already reaching for his coat, "after the horses are fed." The ride to her property was challenging but breathtaking. The familiar landscape had been rendered alien by the snow, with familiar landmarks buried or transformed into strange new shapes. When they crested the final rise overlooking her valley, Nora gasped in dismay. Where her cabin had stood was now a partial ruin. The weight of snow had indeed been too much for the aging roof timbers, collapsing the eastern section entirely. "Oh no," she whispered, despair washing over her. All her hard work, her independence, her fresh start crushed beneath tons of snow. Quinn's hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and steadying. "We'll rebuild it," he said firmly. "Better than before. I'll help you." Nora turned to look at him, finding no pity in his expression, only determination and something else, something that made her breath catch. "You must be tired of rescuing me by now," she said, attempting humor despite the tears that threatened. "Never," he answered simply. The single word held such conviction that Nora found herself believing him. They approached the cabin cautiously. The western half had held, and Quinn was able to retrieve most of her belongings: clothing, books, the quilt her mother had made, her teaching materials. "You'll stay with me until we can rebuild," Quinn said as they loaded her salvaged possessions into his wagon. It wasn't a question. Nora knew she should protest, should worry about propriety and reputation. Instead, she found herself nodding. "Thank you." Winter settled in with a vengeance after that initial storm, making reconstruction impossible until spring. Nora moved into Quinn's cabin, a modest but well-built structure with 2 rooms separated by a curtain for privacy. She took the small bedroom, while Quinn slept near the hearth in the main room. News of her situation spread quickly through the scattered community, but rather than scandal, it provoked an outpouring of support. Martha Wilson arrived with her husband Richard, bringing extra bedding and preserved foods. "Lucky you had Quinn nearby," Martha said meaningfully as she helped Nora organize the cabin's small storage area. "Man's the best builder in 3 counties. That barn of his withstood the worst storm we've seen in 20 years without so much as a shingle out of place." Nora nodded, thinking of the solid refuge that barn had provided. "He's been very kind." Martha gave her a knowing look. "Kind isn't the word most would use for Quinn Eastwood. Honorable, yes, hardworking, certainly, but warm, that's new." She paused her work, lowering her voice though Quinn was outside with Richard. "He's different around you, Nora, happier." The observation left Nora flustered, unsure how to respond. Was it possible Quinn felt the same growing attachment she did? The same quickening of pulse when their hands accidentally touched, the same warmth spreading through her chest when he smiled. Life settled into a new rhythm as winter deepened. School continued in Carson Creek whenever the weather permitted travel, with Quinn often escorting Nora on the journey. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire in companionable silence or easy conversation. Quinn taught her to play checkers, and they became evenly matched opponents, each victory celebrated with good-natured ribbing. On Christmas Eve, Quinn surprised her with a small fir tree, somehow procured despite the deep snow. They decorated it with paper stars Nora had made with her students and strings of dried berries. "It's beautiful," Nora said, standing back to admire their handiwork. "I didn't think I'd have Christmas this year." Quinn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Got something for you," he said gruffly, looking suddenly unsure of himself. "It's not much." Nora carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a delicately carved wooden hair comb. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with tiny flowers etched along its curve. "Quinn," she breathed, running her finger over the detailed work. "Did you make this?" He nodded, looking boyishly pleased at her reaction. "Been working on it nights after you'd gone to sleep. Thought maybe, well, a lady should have pretty things." Impulsively, Nora reached up and placed it in her hair, securing a stray curl. "How does it look?" Quinn's expression softened as he gazed at her. "Perfect," he said quietly. Nora felt a blush warming her cheeks. "I have something for you too." She retrieved a package from beneath her bed, a new scarf she'd knitted from wool Martha had provided. "It's practical rather than beautiful, I'm afraid." Quinn wrapped it around his neck immediately, his smile genuine. "It's the finest gift I've received in years," he declared. They stood there in the glow of the fire and the small candles on their tree, something unspoken humming in the air between them. Quinn took a step closer, his expression intent. Nora's heart thundered in her chest as she tilted her face up toward his. A sudden pounding on the door shattered the moment. Quinn opened it to find Richard Wilson, his face grave beneath his snow-dusted hat. "Sorry to disturb you on Christmas Eve," he said, "but the Johnsons' youngest has taken a bad turn with fever. Mrs. Johnson's asking if the school teacher might come, says you know medicines from back east." Nora was already reaching for her coat. "Of course I'll come." The medical knowledge she'd gleaned from her mother, a midwife in Pennsylvania, proved valuable that night as she helped bring down little Emma Johnson's dangerous fever with willow bark tea and cool compresses. It was nearly dawn on Christmas Day when the child's fever finally broke, leaving her sleeping peacefully. Quinn had waited with quiet patience in the Johnsons' small front room, speaking in low tones with Frank Johnson about cattle prices and spring prospects. When Nora emerged from the sick room with good news, his relief was palpable. The ride home was silent, both too exhausted for conversation. The magic of the previous evening seemed to have dissipated with the night's emergency, leaving Nora wondering if she'd imagined the moment of connection. January brought fresh snow and bitter cold, but February saw a gradual warming that hinted at an early spring. As the days lengthened, Quinn began to speak more frequently of rebuilding her cabin. "We'll need to clear the site first," he said one evening as they sat at his small table, finishing a supper of venison stew. "Then I'm thinking a steeper roof pitch this time to shed snow better, and we should add support beams here and here." He sketched quickly on a scrap of paper. Nora watched him, a strange hollowness forming in her chest. Of course she needed her own home again, needed to resume her independent life. So why did the prospect fill her with such melancholy? "Quinn," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking." He looked up from his sketch, eyebrows raised in question. "Perhaps instead of rebuilding exactly as it was, we might consider something different." Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Something larger, perhaps, with room for a family. Quinn went very still, his pencil frozen above the paper. "A family," he repeated carefully. Nora gathered her courage. "These past months living here with you, I've never been happier, even with the disaster of losing my cabin, even with the hardships of winter." She met his gaze steadily. "I think you feel it too, this connection between us." For a moment, Quinn didn't move, didn't speak. Then he set down his pencil with deliberate care. "Nora, if I'm wrong, please tell me now," she interrupted, suddenly terrified she'd misread everything. "You're not wrong," he said quickly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "God knows, you're not wrong. I've felt it since that first day in the storm when you looked at my barn and saw not just shelter but craftsmanship." He squeezed her fingers. "But I have nothing to offer a woman like you, just a hardscrabble ranch and a life of endless work." Nora laughed softly. "And what exactly do you think I've been doing these past months, sitting around embroidering handkerchiefs?" She turned her hand in his, intertwining their fingers. "I love this life, Quinn. I love the challenges, the beauty, the community we've found here." She took a deep breath. "And I love you." Quinn's expression transformed, wonder replacing doubt. "I love you too, Nora Blackett. Have since you stood on your porch in the autumn sunlight and told me you weren't afraid of hard work." He rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and came around the table to kneel beside her. "I don't have a ring yet, but Nora, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Joy burst through her like sunshine. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." Their wedding took place in early April, with the snow mostly melted and the first green shoots appearing in the newly exposed earth. The entire scattered community gathered at the Carson Creek Meeting Hall, which had been transformed with wildflowers and ribbon for the occasion. Martha Wilson had helped Nora remake one of her dresses into a suitable wedding gown, adding lace salvaged from her mother's clothing. Quinn stood tall and proud at the front of the hall, wearing a new shirt and his best trousers, his usually unruly hair slicked down with water. When Nora appeared at the doorway, a simple bouquet of early prairie flowers in her hands, his face lit with such happiness that several of the older women dabbed at their eyes. The circuit preacher, who happened to be passing through at just the right time, Providence, Martha Wilson declared, confidently performed the ceremony with dignified brevity. When Quinn and Nora sealed their vows with a kiss, the cheers nearly raised the roof. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food contributed by every family, music provided by anyone who could play an instrument, and dancing that grew increasingly spirited as the night wore on. Quinn surprised everyone, including Nora, by being an excellent dancer, guiding her through waltzes and reels with unexpected grace. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked breathlessly as they twirled among the other couples. "My mother insisted all her boys learn properly," he replied, a tender smile crossing his face at the memory. "Said a man who could dance would never lack for female companionship." "Smart woman," Nora laughed, leaning into his embrace. When they finally departed amid good-natured teasing and a shower of dried flower petals, Quinn helped Nora into the wagon he'd decorated specially for the occasion with sprigs of pine and ribbons. "Where are we going?" she asked, realizing they weren't heading toward his ranch, their ranch now. "You'll see," he said mysteriously, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They traveled in the bright moonlight for about 20 minutes, following a route that gradually became familiar to Nora. When they crested the rise overlooking her valley, the sight of her collapsed cabin, she gasped in surprise. There, silhouetted against the night sky, stood a new structure. Not a cabin, but a proper house, with a wide porch wrapping around two sides and smoke curling invitingly from a stone chimney. "Quinn," she breathed, unable to believe her eyes. "How did you win?" "Been working on it since February," he admitted, looking boyishly proud as he helped her down from the wagon. "The whole community pitched in, wanted it to be a surprise." He took her hand, leading her toward their new home. "It's not quite finished inside, but the important parts are done." The interior was simple but beautiful, with smooth plank floors, whitewashed walls, and a large stone fireplace where a welcoming fire already burned. A proper cook stove gleamed in the kitchen area, and sturdy furniture some she recognized from Quinn's cabin, some new, was arranged comfortably throughout the main room. "There's 3 bedrooms," Quinn said, a hint of shyness in his voice. "Thought we might need them someday." "For a family." Nora turned to him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "It's perfect, Quinn, absolutely perfect." He pulled her gently into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Eastwood." Their life together unfolded with the seasons, each day bringing new challenges and joys. The school in Carson Creek became official, with Nora teaching 3 days a week in a proper schoolhouse built by the community that summer. Quinn's cattle herd grew, as did their crops and garden. They worked side by side, equal partners in building their future. Their first child, a daughter they named Catherine after Nora's mother, arrived the following spring, filling their home with a new kind of joy. Quinn proved to be a doting father, carrying the infant with him as he did chores around the ranch, singing old cavalry songs as lullabies. "She needs to know the sound of her father's voice," he explained when Nora found him in the barn, earnestly explaining the proper way to brush down a horse to the wide-eyed infant strapped to his chest. "Girl needs to learn these things early." Catherine grew into a lively toddler with Quinn's determined expression and Nora's auburn curls. She followed her father everywhere, helping with ranch chores and solemnly explaining to the cattle that they should be good cows. Their second child, a son they named James, joined the family 2 years later. He was a quieter baby than his sister had been, watching the world with solemn eyes before breaking into heart-melting smiles. Life wasn't always easy. Drought came one summer, threatening their crops and forcing them to sell off some of their herd. A particularly harsh winter followed, testing even Quinn's carefully constructed buildings. Through it all, they faced each challenge together, finding strength in their partnership and joy in their growing family. The barn remained the heart of their ranch, solid and dependable through every storm. Quinn continued to improve it over the years, adding a larger loft, better stalls, a proper tack room. It was where Catherine learned to ride her first pony, where James took his first steps, where community gatherings were held when the weather turned too cold for outdoor socials. 5 years into their marriage, Nora stood in the doorway of the barn, watching as Quinn taught Catherine how to properly feed a newborn calf whose mother had rejected it. The little girl's face was a study in concentration as she carefully held the bottle, her father's large hands steadying hers. James toddled around the straw-covered floor, occasionally stopping to pat the patient barn cats who kept the mouse population in check. Sunlight streamed through the high windows. Quinn had added dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The scene before her was everything Nora had never known. She wanted this family, this life, this love. She placed a hand on her stomach, where their third child had just begun to make its presence known. She hadn't told Quinn yet, saving the news for that evening when the children were asleep. As if sensing her gaze, Quinn looked up and smiled, that same warm smile that had first begun to melt her heart during a blizzard years ago. Catherine waved excitedly, nearly dropping the bottle in her enthusiasm. "Mama, come see, I'm feeding him all by myself." Nora crossed the barn to join her family, her footsteps light on the solid floor Quinn had laid with such care. Outside, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, another spring storm brewing. But here, in this space her husband had built strong enough to withstand any tempest, surrounded by the laughter and light of their children, Nora Eastwood felt nothing but peace. 10 years later, on their anniversary, Quinn and Nora sat together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard. Catherine, now a young lady of 9, was teaching her youngest brother, 4-year-old Thomas, how to fly a kite in the spring breeze. James and their middle daughter, Elizabeth, were engaged in an elaborate game involving the fort Quinn had built them last summer. "Did you ever imagine this?" Nora asked, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "That day you found me sheltering from the storm, did you picture any of this?" Quinn's arm tightened around her waist. "Not specifically," he admitted, his voice warm with contentment. "But I knew you were special from that first moment, knew you'd change everything." From the direction of the barn came the sound of laughter as Catherine abandoned the kite lesson to chase Thomas, who squealed with delight as he ran toward the solid structure that had stood through a decade of Montana seasons. "Best investment I ever made," Quinn remarked, nodding toward the barn. "Built it hoping it would protect my future, never dreamed how right I'd be." Nora smiled, thinking of all the memories held within those sturdy walls the night they'd sheltered from the blizzard, the first time Catherine had ridden her pony in circles around its interior, the community dances they'd hosted when snow made travel to Carson Creek impossible, the quiet conversations she and Quinn still shared there when they needed moments away from busy household demands. "You built it strong enough for storms," she said softly. "I just filled it with laughter." Quinn turned to her, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way she loved. Gray now peppered his dark hair, and the lines of his face had deepened with the passing years, but his gaze still held the same warmth that had first drawn her to him. "And light," he added, kissing her gently. "You filled it with light." Around them, their ranch continued to thrive, a testament to shared dreams and mutual effort. The house had expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. The cattle herd was one of the finest in the territory. The school in Carson Creek, now a proper town with a church and doctor's office, bore a plaque honoring Nora as its founding teacher. Yet for all they had built together, it was the moments like these, quiet togetherness, while their children played in safety and happiness, that Nora treasured most. The life they had created wasn't without hardship or sorrow, but it was rich with love, secure in the foundation they had laid together. As the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Quinn stood and offered Nora his hand. "Come on," he said with a smile that still made her heart quicken after all these years. "Let's round up those children of ours for supper." Hand in hand, they walked toward their family, their laughter joining with their children's in the golden evening light. Behind them, the barn Quinn had built stood strong and sure against the darkening sky, a silent guardian of the joy they had found within its walls and the love that had grown beyond them, spreading across the land they now called home.